All right, good morning, group. Today, this week, and really the next 2 weeks, we're going to be looking at this chapter 10, which is talking about energy expenditure during exercise. And they list a few key activities, which I guess we could kind of summarize as cardiovascular exercise, aerobic exercise, etc. Exercise, where we're going to get the majority of our energy from the aerobic energy system, which is why it's called aerobic exercise, right? So there's some initial slides that we're going to go through kind of quickly, and this is not really stuff that I think is super important for you all to learn in an intro to exercise science class. However, I'm going to just introduce it to you briefly and kind of throw out a couple of the key concepts that I'd like for you to retain. And in the second half of the PowerPoint, we'll focus on the lab that we're going to do this week and next week both. This PowerPoint will serve as sort of the PowerPoint for the next 2 weeks. I'm not going to do a different voiceover chapter. For next week, we'll just have another lab utilizing a different mode. The lab this week is going to be treadmill testing, and the lab next week will be cycle testing. So you get to see and experience virtually what an exercise test looks like using running and biking. All right, so the slides are not advancing. There we go. When we talk about energy expenditure, two of the common terms that are used are gross versus net, okay? So before we talk about that specifically, think about like your income, right? Your gross income is how much money you make overall. Your net income is how much you make after taxes are taken out, okay? Similar concept applies here that your gross energy expenditure is all of the energy that you expend during the course of a day, right? Or during a given activity. And that includes your resting energy expenditure, okay? Which is always going to be there, right? We're always, just like we're always paying taxes, we're always having to expend energy to fuel our resting metabolic functions, which is like the basic organ function, etc. Okay. The net energy expenditure, on the other hand, is all of the energy you expend specifically for a given activity, and that does not include your resting metabolic rate, right? So gross energy expenditure includes the energy required for the resting metabolic function. The net energy expenditure does not include that, okay? Just like your net income does not include the money that you pay in taxes, right? So when we're calculating energy expenditure, specifically during exercise, and when we're measuring it, as we're going to do in the labs this week and next week, usually we're just focusing on the net energy expenditure. How much is directly contributing towards that activity by itself, okay? Now, there are some calculations that I'm going to just show you all what they look like. We're not going to actually do them, but they actually include the resting energy expenditure as kind of like a separate component, and I'll point that out to you all when we look at those equations here in a little bit, okay? So, again, now we're talking about the energy that's going towards exercise, okay? Another concept we want to kind of introduce today is this fact of, or this idea of efficiency or economy, okay? The more efficient something is, the less energy it uses, okay? So like an energy efficient home, for example, will require less electricity, less natural gas, right? An energy efficient car would use less gasoline than a giant truck, which would presumably be not energy efficient. So when we exercise, there are different things that we can do in different environmental conditions that will affect our efficiency or our economy, okay? Now, before we jump into efficiency in the economy piece of it, I want to remind you all of something that I mentioned probably several lectures ago, and that is that in general, the human body is a very inefficient machine. And what that means is only a minority percentage of the energy that we liberate when we split ATP goes towards the production of work, okay? The majority of it gets dissipated as heat. And again, that explains why when we're exercising, our body temperature rises, because a lot of the ATP that we're splitting apart just gets converted into heat, and then that heat warms our body, okay? And as we're recovering from exercise, part of that recovery process is getting rid of all that heat that accumulated in our body as a result of using ATP, okay? So in general, we say that in terms of mechanical efficiency, only about 25% of the energy that is liberated from ATP directly goes towards the production of work. And by work, I mean walking, running, or stationary cycling. So what we see in this bullet point is that for walking, running, and cycling, we only have about 20 to 25% mechanical efficiency. That's not great, right? If you had a car that ran on 20 to 25% efficiency, you would burn a lot of fuel, you'd spend a lot of money, okay? Mechanical efficiency can decline to 20% or less for activities that have drag forces. And a good example of that we'll see in a second is swimming. The water, when you're in the water, right, the force of the water is creating a drag on your body that kind of slows you down. That reduces your mechanical efficiency. If you're running outside and there's a very strong wind blowing in your face, that would create a drag, and that's going to pull your efficiency down. And what are the implications of that, really? Well, you have to work harder, right? Running outside with no wind is easier and will require less energy than running outside with a very heavy wind blowing in your face. You're going to have to use more energy than you would if you were running with no wind at all, okay? So we see here there are some other things that affect mechanical efficiency other than the specific activity or the external conditions. You have body size, gender, fitness level, and then the skill, right? Obviously, an obese individual, their mechanical efficiency is going to be reduced because they have so much more mass that they have to move in one of these activities that we see here. So their efficiency would be lessened, okay? Gender, I don't really think that's a huge factor. However, certain anatomical differences between males and females, and I'll let you kind of figure out what I mean when I say that, could lead to weight being distributed differently, and that could reduce efficiency, right? I'll just go ahead and say it. If a female has like large breasts, for example, that sort of throws off the center of gravity, and that could reduce mechanical efficiency. So how would you combat that? Well, just get a sports bra that keeps everything nice and tight. That can help improve the mechanical efficiency. Obviously, if a woman is pregnant, mechanical efficiency is greatly reduced because, again, the center of mass is altered. The stride, the overall body movement pattern would be reduced as well. That's going to reduce efficiency. And what that means is that person is going to have to expend more energy to accomplish the same task that someone who has good efficiency would have to spend, okay? Skill is, I think, maybe one of the most important things. And I'd like to have you all just kind of think, if you've ever been at a public park and you've noticed, just a group of people, not together, but just random people running, right? And if you haven't noticed this, try to notice it next time you're out in public exercising or around people who are exercising. Some people, now you might think running doesn't require skill, but it actually does, right? And you can tell if you just watch random people running, the people who have skill, right? Their stride is very compact. They have good arm action. There's no lateral movement. There's no rotational movement, etc. Their efficiency of movement is very good, and therefore they have good, work economy. They're going to get the most of the energy that they're expending. Where a novice runner who is unskilled, they waste a lot of energy with non-essential body movements, such as twisting when they're running. Okay, you probably see that some. Knees coming together when people run, and then their feet fly out to the side when they run. That is inefficient movement as well, and that kind of shows like a lower skill with running. So again, if you took somebody who had highly skilled runner versus a low skill runner, the highly skilled runner will be more efficient and therefore will accomplish the same amount of work with less energy utilization, right? So if those two people are running a race against each other, the skilled person who is more efficient is most likely going to win the race, right? Hands down. In this equation, this is again not something I'm going to ask you all to complete or even understand right now, but just to kind of generally explain it. You have the efficiency is a function of work accomplished divided by the energy expenditure, right? So how much energy was expended, how much work was accomplished, you divide that by 100 to get a percentage. So an efficient person would accomplish more work as a function of the energy expended, which would lead to a higher percentage, more efficiency. A less efficient person would accomplish less work for a given amount of energy expenditure, which would reduce their percentage and therefore reduce their mechanical efficiency. One more thing on this, just think about your own life. If you've ever, if you're fairly experienced at a sport right now, think back to when you started that sport, right? When you didn't really have skill and know what you were doing and your body movements weren't coordinated. You probably got a lot more fatigued playing that sport then versus later once you had gained experience and become more skilled. The body movements were programmed kind of into your muscle memory, etc. You became more efficient at that sport, so your overall energy requirement to play that sport was reduced because you were more efficient, right? You got more out of the energy that you were putting into it. You were able to accomplish more work based upon the energy that you were expending while playing that sport. Okay, let's move on. So here we're going to go through a couple of the activities and talk about the factors that can affect affect efficiency. I'm sorry. Just a couple quick things to throw out. It's been found that walking efficiency is highest at these speeds, right? So, or in this speed range. If you walk slower than 1.9 miles per hour, you're actually reducing your efficiency, okay? Now, for a child, that could be different, right? We're talking about adults here. But walking faster than 3.1 miles per hour also will reduce efficiency as well. It's almost like if you're going to go faster than this, you might want to jog instead. Jogging could be more efficient than trying to walk at 4 miles per hour, okay? Other factors that would affect walking energy expenditure, the body mass, we already sort of mentioned that the more body mass you have, the higher the energy requirement will be to displace that mass against gravity. That's going to pull efficiency down. The terrain or the walking surface. If the terrain and the surface is nice and smooth, efficiency is high. If it's hilly, if the terrain is uneven, that's going to reduce efficiency. If you've ever been to the beach, right, and you're walking down near the water line where there's a slope, you've probably noticed that it's a little bit harder to walk on a slope. It's harder to run on a slope for sure, like a lateral slope, which could also take us to the grade, right? That could be the hill that you're walking up. Obviously, walking up a hill is more difficult, okay? Different types of footwear can reduce efficiency. I've never personally worn heels, but I've seen women wear heels, and I would imagine it's a lot harder to walk in heels than it is to walk in running shoes, for example, right? Flip-flops. I've walked in those plenty of times, and it's annoying if you have to walk any distance at all in flip-flops because you have to kind of waste energy trying to keep them on your feet, right? Where athletic shoes, they stay on nice and well, efficiency is improved in that type of footwear. Now this kind of jumps into running, but this goes into skill, I think, as well. the length of your stride and the frequency of your stride can definitely influence your efficiency, okay? And I think this is where experience comes into play. I know for myself, running is kind of my primary form of exercise, that I notice that there's a certain speed for me where my stride really is the most comfortable and my efficiency seems to improve and I don't feel as tired when I run in this certain speed range, okay? If I try to run slower than that, and for me, that's around like 7 to 8 miles per hour. So if I try to run at 6 miles per hour, it's almost too slow, right? And my stride because it's slow, my stride frequency is reduced, okay? And my stride length almost kind of lengthens out. And for my body, that is inefficient. But as I speed up a little bit, I have to accelerate my frequency of strides, of steps, okay? And by doing that, the stride length tends to shrink a little bit to where I ultimately meet this sort of happy medium between frequency and stride. And for myself, for me, that is the optimal speed that I can run at, okay? So I think all humans, right, we have this sort of an inverse relationship between frequency and length. When you're sprinting, your frequency is very rapid, so your length should be short, right? You should have very choppy steps, especially during the acceleration phase. Where when you're running slower, your frequency is lower and your length can be longer, okay? So I think the key for a human who is trying to become a better runner, you want to try to find that speed that for you is the most efficient sort of balance between frequency and length. And once you find that, your overall energy expenditure efficiency will be optimized or sort of peaked out at its highest, okay? So if you're a runner out there listening to this, think about that next time you're running, vary your stride length and your frequency a little bit as you're running, and just kind of see how that makes your body feel, see how that makes your breathing change, and just manipulate it a little bit. And ultimately the goal would be to try to find like the optimal length and frequency combination to allow you to be the most efficient with your energy expenditure. Other things that can affect running efficiency, we see here the air density, the runner's projected surface area, right? So the air density is referring to the thickness of the air, right? At sea level, the concentration, the air pressure is higher, so the air is more dense, versus if we were up in the mountains, the air is thinner. So theoretically, there's less drag on our body. The downside, though, is there's also less oxygen at altitude, so it doesn't really help us too much, okay? The runner's projected surface area, so that refers to kind of how wide you are, right? The thinner you are, there's going to be less air resistance as you're cutting through the air, versus if you're wider, then you're going to have more resistance you're going to encounter as you're running through, cutting through the air as well, okay? I think we also the surface area of foot contact. When you're running, you want to minimize the amount of your foot that contacts the ground. The more of your foot that contacts the ground, the more you're going to slow down, right? So you want to have, ideally when you're running, the ball of your foot is only hitting, and it's hitting for a very short period of time, and you're running very light on your feet. That's going to minimize the resistance based upon the surface area, okay? And wind, we kind of already talked about. The more wind that there is, that's going to reduce efficiency. And you can see here that there's about a 3 to 9% change versus no wind here versus running through the wind. So your energy expenditure increases by about 6% if you're running in the wind. And that could be why as we show here, if you're running on a treadmill versus a track, obviously on a track, you have the air resistance, possibly some wind that could slow you down, versus on a treadmill, there should not be any of that type of stuff. So what this is showing us is on the treadmill, energy expenditure, is actually reduced when you're indoors. And again, that's because you're not having to cut through the elements, etc. Now, just lastly to touch on this, to kind of hit on this point about the drag, and this is swimming. With swimming, because you're in the water, there's much greater drag on the body versus being in the air when you're running or walking. So the fact that there is this increased drag on your body from the water is going to greatly reduce mechanical efficiency, right? You're going to move a lot slower because you're in the water, obviously. That also should tell us that swimming is going to have an increased energy expenditure compared to running. And that's why swimming is a good activity and very challenging, is because you have to work harder in the water because there's more resistance you're having to overcome versus what you're doing in the air. Now, on the other side, you don't have to bear your own weight in the water, right? Swimming is a non-weight bearing activity versus running is a weight bearing activity, and that's going to increase the energy cost. So honestly, it kind of evens out. Energy expenditure is pretty similar, swimming versus running. Swimming is just much more inefficient versus running because of that drag force. All right, so let's transition now to what we're going to be looking at for the lab. Okay, so before we get into the specifics, I do want to sort of point out again something that maybe we've talked about before. And that's the difference between direct measurement and prediction. Okay, so for energy expenditure, there's two ways we could determine it. We can either predict it using an equation, okay, or we can directly measure it with lab equipment. Now, we did this with our last lab with resting metabolic rate. I had you all utilize that Harris-Benedict equation to predict the resting metabolic rate for our subject, but then we also measured the metabolic rate of the subject as well, and I asked you all to compare the two numbers. I haven't looked lately, but if memory serves, they were pretty close to one another, off by maybe like a couple hundred calories, which is not terrible, right? But I guess the idea is if you have the option of direct measurement, you would take that because it's going to be more accurate, okay? As I say here, direct measurement will always result in greater accuracy, okay? Anytime we're predicting something, there is going to be what we call this SEE, which stands for the standard error of estimate, okay? Whenever you're using an equation, usually the standard error of estimate will be given, okay? So you'll know what your and error is usually expressed in like a plus or minus 3. So for example, for body fat percentage measurement using skin fold caliper, the measurement error is plus or minus 3.5%, right? So that means if you measure somebody's body fat percentage with the calipers and you determine it's 15%, the error tells you, well, it could be 11.5% or it could be 18.5%, because 15 plus or minus 3.5% gives us more of a range versus an individual number, right? With direct measurement, however, we can hone that in and get that specific number versus having to kind of consider the range, okay? So the lab today is going to be direct measurement of VO2 max. Before we get to that, I wanted to just show you how we could predict energy expenditure in different activities as well, because sometimes that's more practical, right? And that's the thing with direct measurement. It's not always practical because often you need very expensive equipment and access to a lab. And in a lot of situations, you're not going to have that, okay? In most, you're not. So therefore, it's going to be much more practical to use equations to predict energy expenditure. In most settings, it's more practical. Now, don't panic when you look at this, because I'm not even going to have you all solve these. I just want to show them to you. But these are equations we could use to predict energy expenditure in the common cardiovascular activities. So the American College of Sports Medicine, which is what the ACSM stands for, a long time ago, they developed these, what they call the metabolic equations, and they allow us to plug in different numbers. So for example, if we look at the walk-in equation, if we knew the speed the person was walking at and the percent grade they were walking at, we could calculate what their energy expenditure is during that activity, okay? Same thing with running. The equation looks very similar. All we need to know is the speed and the percent grade. And if we know those things, we can calculate their energy expenditure. Cycling. What's the resistance? What's the load that they're pedaling against? We can express that in either watts or what are called kilogram meters per minute, okay? And then we just need to know their body mass, okay? For stepping, either on a box or a stair stepper, how fast are they walking? What's the height of the step? Again, we can calculate their energy expenditure. So these are very accurate and they're useful, okay? I'm not going to have you all do this, but in my professional life as like a fitness professional, you can use these equations to tell somebody how many calories that they burn, like doing certain activities. And that's valuable information that people are interested in learning, okay? One last thing I want to point out on these is you'll notice over here on the far right of the equation, we add 3.5, we add 3.5, we add 3.5. This is an account of resting energy expenditure, right? So when we're doing these equations, we are actually calculating the gross energy expenditure because we're including a number that is associated with resting energy expenditure. We usually consider resting energy expenditure to be 3.5 milliliters per kilogram per minute. Milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute. This is the unit that we use to express oxygen consumption. Okay, so resting energy expenditure, again, is agreed upon, assumed to be 3.5 ml per kg per minute. Now, for the cycling equation, it's 7, which is obviously 3.5 plus 3.5. So we have 3.5 for the resting energy expenditure, and then we have another 3.5, which is the cost of just unloaded cycling, right? So just sitting on a bike and spinning the pedals with no resistance at all gives you an additional 3.5. Again, not something you all need to worry about today, but down the road you might see this stuff again, so I wanted to introduce it to you. So what we're going to focus on now, the rest of the lecture, which hopefully won't be too much longer, excuse me, is measurement of energy expenditure using lab equipment. So we're going to use that Parvo metabolic cart, the same one that we used for the resting metabolic rate test, okay, to measure the energy cost and ultimately the aerobic capacity. So what is the maximal aerobic energy capacity, expenditure capacity, maximal aerobic capacity of an individual? And we can measure that doing what we call a VO2 max test, okay? So the next 2 labs we're going to do are going to involve VO2 max tests. The one we're going to do this week is lab 2, VO2 max test on a treadmill, so a running test. And then the one we're going to do next week is a VO2 max test on a bike, but we're also going to measure the lactate threshold as well in next week's lab, okay? And the reason we're doing that is because to measure lactate, we have to prick the fingertip and take a blood sample during the test. When somebody is running, it's very hard to do that, obviously. But when they're biking and their arms are stationary, they can just pop their hand over, take the blood, and then get back. And they can keep pedaling, moving their legs the entire time. So usually when we do lactate threshold tests, we do those on the bike because the person can continue exercising while we take the blood sample. If we were running, they would have to jump to the sides of the treadmill, stop running for about 20 to 30 seconds while we get the blood sample. Then they start running again, and that can interfere with the oxygen consumption measurements. So let's just talk a little bit about maximal oxygen consumption, or the abbreviation that we more commonly use is the VO2 max. Now, as I said, there are 2 ways, 2 units that we can use to express VO2 max. The most common way is what I mentioned a few minutes ago, using the unit ml per kg per minute. And again, what that stands for is ml is milliliters, and we're talking about milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight, and we're talking about the body weight of whoever our subject is, okay? Oops, sorry, per minute, okay? Now, another way we can express VO2 max is in liters of oxygen per minute. Okay, the bad thing with this expression is it doesn't include the body weight of the person as part of the equation. If we're going to compare VO2 maxes of different people, we want to use this unit because it corrects for different body sizes. Okay. What we're referring to with VO2 max is the maximal rate of oxygen that is being consumed, and by that we mean utilized for energy production by metabolically active cells. Okay, this is a key phrase that we're going to come back and talk to here in just a second. VO2 max is typically considered to be the criterion measure, or like the gold standard measurement for aerobic capacity, and doing the test with the metabolic cart again is going to give us a very accurate measurement, and that's why it's considered to be the gold standard. So let's talk about some factors that can affect VO2 max. Genetics is a huge influence here, okay? Anywhere from 40 to 66% of your VO2 max is influenced by your genetics, okay? From what I've learned, you get that influence from your maternal side. So your mother contributes the DNA that influences your aerobic capacity, right? So you all just think about your parents right now. If you're a good runner, is your mom a good runner? Maybe both your parents are, I don't know. And it doesn't always hold up true 100%, because in my case, neither of my parents are athletes. So I can't really like trace my decency at running towards that. But again, a lot of your variance comes from your genetics. Okay, so some people are going to be more genetically inclined to have higher VO2 maxes, others not so much. So just a few numbers to look at. For the average college age male and female, this is the average VO2 max. So the average male, age 20 to 29, 45 to 49 ml per kg per minute. That's the average VO2 max. For females, it is lower, okay? And we'll talk about why the average male VO2 max is higher than the average female here in just a second. But just to focus on the genetic component for a second, elite distance runners, so we're talking about Olympic level runners, they may have a VO2 max as high as 80, right? So clearly if you look at the average male or the average female versus an elite distance runner, the elite distance runner clearly has a genetic predisposition towards having a high aerobic capacity, right? So that has been passed down through the generations from their ancestors, that they genetically have a high aerobic capacity, where others, we may not, okay? A famous aerobic athlete, Lance Armstrong, his VO2 max was measured at 84 to 85 ml per kg per minute, which is almost double what the average person's is, right? So clearly Lance Armstrong has some genetic predisposition to having a high aerobic capacity. Now, he might have cheated to get a little bit of that, which looks like he probably did, but nevertheless, his was still really, really great. Now, to contrast that to somebody who's had a heart attack. So MI stands for myocardial infarction. That's the technical term for heart attack. When somebody has had a heart attack, some of their heart muscle has literally died, okay? And the less heart muscle you have, the lower your pumping capacity will be, and the lower your VO2 max will be, okay? So somebody who's had a heart attack, their VO2 max might drop to the teens to low 20s, right? Contrast that to, again, the average male or female. And this can show us why somebody who has had a heart attack has a very hard time doing basic activities like going up and down stairs, walking, short distances. Their heart simply doesn't have the capacity to pump enough oxygen-rich blood to allow them to do those basic activities, okay? Now, last thing with genetics, look at these animals, right? Thoroughbred racehorses have had a VO2 max close to 180 measured. Sled dogs, 240. So we're talking about, 4 to 5 times that of your average human. And think about the differences here, right? Obviously, a racehorse is a giant animal, much bigger than a human. And if the body of the animal is bigger than the human, what inside the body is also going to be bigger? Well, the heart, right? The average human's heart is about the size of our fist. So imagine how big the heart of a thoroughbred racehorse would be. Larger heart, larger pumping capacity, that's going to lead to a larger VO2 max, okay? Dogs, now that doesn't necessarily hold true, right? A dog is roughly similar size as a human. They probably have a similar size heart as a human. So with a sled dog, you're looking at more the ability of the muscles to use oxygen-rich blood. So if we think back to that Fick equation that we talked about last lecture, the Fick equation states VO2 is equal to cardiac output, which is the heart, times the AVO2 difference, and that's the ability for the muscles to extract and use oxygen, right? So the racehorse has a really great Q. The sled dog has a really great AVO2 difference, okay? And that might explain why they have such high VO2 maxes. Let's move on to a couple other factors. Age, it's been found that after the age of 25, sorry, I'm fighting off a sneeze here, VO2 max declines by 1% per year. So if we look over here at the average VO2 max for males and females both, as people get older, VO2 max tends to slowly decline. Now, this is another one of those what came first, the chicken or the egg situations. What also declines as people get older? Well, their level of physical activity, okay? So what I tend to always say is if somebody stays physically active as they age, you can mitigate the loss in your VO2 max, right? So yes, you might see a decline related to age, but it'll be less than somebody who's sedentary. Sedentary means they don't exercise at all, right? So it's important as you all get older and, you know, for your family members, other people you know, maintaining a pattern of physical activity can help slow down the loss in aerobic capacity that occurs with age, okay? It's still going to drop some with age, but it's going to drop less than it would if you stopped exercising completely, okay? Gender. So as we saw, average VO2 maxes are lower in females across all age groups. Now that might not be the case in any two given individuals, right? If you have a cross-country athlete that's a female, let's say 21, and you have a sedentary male who's 21, the cross-country running female is going to have a higher VO2 max, okay? These numbers we're looking at here are just the averages. May not apply to any two individuals you pull out of the population, a male and a female. The female could have the higher VO2 max, definitely. But again, these are the averages across the whole population, okay? But why do we see that? Here are a couple of the reasons, okay? Typically, again, on average, males have a larger body. Larger body is going to mean larger heart. Larger heart means larger pumping capacity, which can promote a higher VO2 max, okay? Pretty simple. Larger body also means more blood. More blood means more hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is what carries the oxygen in the blood. So greater oxygen carrying capacity due to larger bodies, okay? Usually males have better body composition, which is also going to be correlated to higher aerobic capacity levels, okay? So again, I want to just say all of this is on average. All of this is on average as well. If we took two individuals from the population, the female could have the higher VO2 max, have a larger body, larger heart, more hemoglobin, etc. We're just looking at averages here, and that's how we get these numbers, okay? Take-home messages. Some people are genetically inclined to having high aerobic capacity. Keep exercising as you get older because that'll help mitigate the loss in your VO2 max, and gender doesn't really affect it necessarily. It's really, again, how much physical activity you do, right? If you have a woman who runs all the time, she could have a higher VO2 max than a male who only runs some of the time. Okay, so as far as testing goes, the mode of exercise could affect your VO2 max, okay? Typically, treadmill is going to give us a higher number for a couple of reasons. One, it's a more familiar form of exercise, right? Most people walk or run, fewer people cycle. So they're going to be more efficient at walking and running, which means they're going to be more efficient at treadmill exercise, more efficiency, more accurate test, okay? Running is also a more full body exercise, right? When you're running, you're using your arms. Those muscles in your arms are going to require oxygen, so that's going to lead to higher oxygen consumption versus if you're cycling, your arms are not moving at all. So there's less active muscle mass when you're cycling. That could lead to lower oxygen consumption levels, okay? So typically we see about a 5 to 25% lower VO2 max measurement on a bike versus a treadmill. Now in our labs, we have two different people doing the test. I'm the runner. One of my graduate assistants is the cycler, so we can't compare. But in the past, when I've done both tests, my VO2 max was about 5 ml per kg per minute less on the bike than a treadmill. And that's again because treadmill is my more familiar form of exercise, okay? The only people you would do a bike test on for accuracy's sake is trained cyclists. So if you have a trained cyclist, you would put them on the bike. Most other people, you would have them run unless they had balance issues. If somebody has balance issues and you're worried about them falling off the treadmill, put them on a bike because they're a lot less likely to fall off the bike than they would be a treadmill, okay? One other factor is if you need to measure blood pressure or, like I said earlier, you need to measure lactate, you might pick the bike because measurements are easier to obtain because, again, the arms are not moving when you're on a bike. When you're running, the arms are moving, so it's a lot harder to measure blood pressure or lactate on a treadmill. Okay, so there's some factors why you might choose the bike over the treadmill for specific purposes. So when we're doing a test for VO2 max, what we use is known as a graded exercise protocol. Okay, so it looks kind of like this. It's a stair step, with the goal of having the first stage be very easy. You want the person to really settle into what we call a steady state, where it's nice and smooth. We're using primarily aerobic energy expenditure for our energy production, very little anaerobic, okay? Usually you're going to do that easy stage for a time period, anywhere from 1 to 3 minutes, okay? In the protocol that we're going to do, the first stage is 3 minutes, okay? We then move to the next stage, and because we're going to increase the intensity, we're going to either make them run faster or add an incline. In the case of the protocol we're going to do in class, we're going to add an incline. Adding an incline is going to make the intensity a little bit harder, okay? And we're going to do that for a specified period of time. In the protocol that we're going to do, the first stage is 3 minutes. Every stage after that is 2 minutes long. And actually, I didn't mean to do that, but that kind of worked out. This is the protocol that we're going to do here in our test that you're going to view, the A-strand treadmill protocol. 3 minutes at a 0%, 2 minutes at 2%, 2 minutes at 4%, etc. We're going to keep the speed the same the entire test. So we increase the intensity by increasing the percent grade every stage, okay? On a bike, it's very similar, and you'll see this next week. We're going to keep the rate of pedaling consistent at 100 RPMs. We're going to increase the workload or the wattage by 50 every stage, okay? This protocol over here is a walking-based protocol, and this is more used in a clinical setting, like if somebody has heart disease, etc. The running protocol is more for your healthy, sort of low-risk participants. But anything else I want to say over here? Now, our goal is for a VO2 max test to last between 8 and 12 minutes, okay? We don't want this to go 15, 20 minutes because then muscle fatigue becomes a factor. We want the test to be relatively short, honestly. So you have to pick a speed that is not too hard because then the test will be too short, but also not too easy because then it can go too long. So what we tend to say is if you've ever run a 5K, what's your mile pace for the 5K? That's the speed that we should use for the VO2 max test, okay? Ideally, you keep this the same the whole test. If you need to tweak it a little bit, it's not the worst thing in the world. For instance, if you're going too slow and you notice the person's heart rate isn't going up appropriately, we might bump the speed up a half a mile per hour just to make it a little bit more difficult. Again, with the goal of the test ending somewhere in this time range here, right? So we're only going to go like 4 to 5 stages. Okay. So again, for lab 2, we're going to do the A-strand treadmill protocol. And then for lab 3, next week, we'll do the cycle ergometer protocol, which is kind of a modified A-strand, because these are very similar in that the speed stays the same. We're increasing the resistance by adding an incline here, increasing the workload here. So before, some things we want to measure before, during, and after the test. We're always going to measure, resting heart rate, resting blood pressure. Blood pressure is measured to make sure that the person's blood pressure is at a safe level. You don't want to have somebody do max exercise if their blood pressure is elevated above a certain number pre-exercise. We're always going to monitor the signs and symptoms, like are they experiencing chest pain, leg pain, etc. And if anybody ever experiences anything like that, you just stop right away, okay? We will measure heart rate during the test, and I'll have you all record that on your lab. Blood pressure, we will not measure during the test, mainly because we're running and it's almost impossible to do that. Okay, we'll just do a pre and a post blood pressure. Something else we're going to measure during the test is what's known as the RPE, rating of perceived exertion. I'll show you what that is here in just a moment. So after the test is over, and again, you're going to watch, I have 3 lab videos again that you'll watch. We have the lab video 1 is kind of like the calibration, the explanation. Video 2 is the test itself. Video 3 is the interpretation, which is what we're going to talk about now. The first thing we're going to do with interpretation is determine if the test is a VO2 max or a VO2 peak, okay? VO2 maxes are more difficult to achieve, and what a VO2 max shows us is that the person achieved what is known as a plateau in oxygen consumption. So a plateau looks like this, right? Even though the speed would increase, their oxygen consumption flatlines and levels out. There's a linear increase earlier. As the speed goes up, VO2 goes up. A plateau indicates that even though the speed goes up, the oxygen consumption fails to continue to increase, okay? This is more difficult to achieve because in order to do this, somebody has to be accustomed to pushing themselves at their max level of exertion for 1 to 2 minutes. So in experienced athletes, it's more common because they're used to pushing themselves at the max level for a prolonged period of time. Less experienced individuals, they're not used to that, so they're more likely to achieve what we call a peak. And a peak is visually represented by this, where we have this increase that occurs, and then once they get to their max level of oxygen consumption, the test just stops because they've kind of reached exhaustion. And I should say that real quick. This test ends when the subject tells you they want to stop, okay? Now, there are times when I, as the administrator, if I see that the numbers are kind of plateauing, I might just stop it because I can tell by watching the data that that they've reached their VO2 max. But we tell the subjects, whenever you want to, we're going to cheer for you to keep going, but when you want to stop, just stop, all right? And that's what occurs in the test that you all will watch here today, okay? Now, numerically, the way that we quantify this, and again, I'll show you how to do this in the lab video, is we're looking at the VO2 values on the data, which I will post in your lab folder, okay? We find the highest number, and then we look at the numbers before it and after it, okay? If the difference in those 3 numbers is less than 2.1 ml per kg per minute, that means we have a plateau, and we would call that a VO2 max. If the numbers are greater, if the difference in the numbers is greater than 2.1, we call that a peak, okay? So the first thing you're going to do with the lab interpretation is determine if this test was a max or a peak, okay? And I'll talk you through this on the video as well. Second thing we're going to do is determine if the test was valid, okay? So how do we know if the person really achieved their VO2 max? There are 4 criteria that we're going to look at, okay? And they're listed here. If they achieve 3 out of the 4 or 4 out of the 4, then we say the test was valid. If we only get 2 out of 4, 1 out of 4, 0 out of 4, then the test was not valid, okay? So here's the criteria. Using the age predicted max heart rate formula, which is 220 minus age, does the person get within 10 of that? So let's say you have a 20-year-old person. Using the formula 220 minus age, their age predicted max heart rate would be 200. That means they just have to get to 190 or higher to satisfy the criteria. They don't have to get to the heart rate. They just have to get to within 10 of the heart rate. Okay, that's criteria 1. Criteria 2, did they get a blood lactate level greater than or equal to 8 to 10 millimoles per liter? Now, during our treadmill test, we're not going to measure lactate, so we cannot look at that one, okay? Lab 3, we will look at that, and we'll use that criteria. Criteria 3, did their respiratory exchange ratio, which we talked about last week, that's the RER, did that number get to 1.1 or above? If yes, they satisfy the criteria. If no, they do not. All right. Then lastly, during the exercise test, at the end of every stage, we're going to take heart rate and we're going to take what is known as the RPE. So the RPE, rating of perceived exertion, is a scale that looks like this. What we do is we ask the person to rank how they feel at the end of the stage, and we have them point to a number on the chart because they can't talk because they got the breathing valve in, right? And you can see these numbers, the scale is 6 to 20. This is meant to correlate to heart rate. Usually your heart rate is between 60 and 200. That's why they chose the numbers of 6 to 20. And these have subjective rankings. Very, very light, fairly light, somewhat hard. An RPE of 15 would be hard. 17 is very hard. So what we're looking for is, do they get to an RPE greater than 17 during the test? So either 18, 19, or 20. If so, they satisfy that criteria, okay? Now, for the treadmill test, we're only going to measure 3 of these, okay? So we have to get 3 out of 3 for the test to be valid. If we only get 2 out of the 3, theoretically, we cannot say the test is valid since we did not measure lactate. Now, in lab 3, we'll measure lactates. We'll have all 4 that we can look at to determine our validity. So again, for lab 2, if we only get 2 out of the 3, we have to say it's not valid, okay? And again, I'll take you all through this in the video, in video clip number 3 that's found in the folder, okay? So our tasks then are to do the study questions as usual. I would go ahead and open up lab 2, have it open on your computer possibly. As you then watch the videos, again, clip 1 is the calibration and sort of the introduction. Clip 2 will be the test itself. Clip 2 is probably going to last around 10 to 12 minutes. And again, I'm the subject actually, and my GAs are administrating it. And you'll see me performing that A-strand treadmill protocol. And then in clip 3, that will be the interpretation. So really, you need the lab open for clip 2 because you'll record the data and then that we call out. And then for clip 3, that's when we'll do the interpretation. And those interpretation questions are at the bottom of the lab, as you'll see, okay? So that is it for this week. Again, there's not going to be a PowerPoint for next week. There will be a lab with videos. We also have an exam next week as well. That's one reason why so there's no study questions. There is a lab and there'll be an exam. The format for the exam will be the same as last time. So if you need to adjust your study habits slightly based upon that, now you know what to expect, okay? Any questions, let me know, and I'll see you all next time.